Betrayal doesn't always come from the outside. Sometimes, it's the people you hold closest who shatter your trust. This is the story of a mother, a son, and the best friend who crossed the ultimate line. A tale of forbidden love, explosive confrontations, and the struggle to pick up the pieces of a broken family. It was a quiet afternoon in Atlanta when Margaret Johnson, a vibrant yet reserved 60-year-old woman, thought she was finally finding peace in her empty nest. Her son, Chris, 30, had been out of the house for years and living his own life. She cherished their weekly Sunday brunches, where they would catch up on everything, family, work, and old memories. But one friendship in Chris's life always unsettled her: his best friend, Ryan Carter. Ryan had been close to Chris since high school, practically another son to Margaret. She welcomed him into her home countless times, feeding him, helping him with college applications, and even comforting him through heartbreaks. But lately Ryan's visits had taken an unusual turn. He started coming over when Chris wasn't around. At first, it was innocent, helping Margaret with groceries or fixing a leaky faucet. But soon his presence became different. Margaret, though perceptive, didn't want to jump to conclusions. That was until one evening when Ryan lingered a bit too long after dinner. "Margaret, I don't think you realize how amazing you are," Ryan had said, his deep brown eyes locking with hers. She laughed nervously, dismissing the comment. "Ryan, stop. You're like a son to me," she replied, turning away to clear the dishes. But Ryan stepped closer, his tone softening. "I'm serious, Margaret. You're not just Chris's mom to me. You've always been more." Her breath caught. She knew it was wrong, wildly inappropriate, but there was something intoxicating about being desired again, especially by someone so young and confident. Against every instinct, Margaret found herself drawn to Ryan's charm. What began as stolen glances turned into secret meetings. Margaret justified it to herself, thinking she deserved happiness after decades of putting others first. But the guilt was crushing. Every time Chris called or came by, she felt like she was betraying him. The bubble finally burst one evening when Chris arrived unannounced. Margaret had just finished dinner with Ryan when Chris let himself in through the back door. "Mom? Ryan?" Chris's voice echoed from the kitchen, sharp with confusion. Margaret froze, her heart pounding. Ryan stepped toward her, trying to steady her trembling hands. "Relax," he whispered, "we'll explain everything." "No. There's nothing to explain," she hissed, her voice shaking. But before they could even compose themselves, Chris stormed into the room. "What the hell is going on here?" he demanded, his eyes darting between them. Ryan tried to speak, but Chris shoved him back. "Get away from my mom. Are you out of your mind?" Margaret pleaded. "Chris, please let me explain." "Explain?" Chris interrupted, his voice breaking. "Ryan, you're my best friend. How could you do this? To me? To her? Please, if you enjoy tales like this, give this video a thumbs up and subscribe for more captivating stories. Hope you've done. Okay, let's continue." Ryan tried to calm him, but Chris wasn't having it. The room erupted into chaos, with Margaret sobbing and Chris shouting. When Margaret finally screamed, "Enough! I can't take this anymore," the room fell silent. Over the next few days their world fell apart. Chris refused to speak to either of them, leaving Margaret devastated. She tried calling him, writing letters, and even showing up at his apartment, but he wouldn't budge. Ryan, meanwhile, was insistent that their connection was real. He begged Margaret not to end things, claiming they could weather the storm. But Margaret was torn. She loved her son more than anything and couldn't bear the thought of losing him. One fateful morning Margaret showed up at Ryan's doorstep, tears streaming down her face. "This has to stop," she said firmly. "I can't lose my son over this." Ryan's face fell, but he nodded, his jaw tightening. "If that's what you want, Margaret, I'll respect it. But I need you to know, I really did love you." Margaret left that day, her heart heavy with regret. She knew she'd never forget Ryan, but she also knew that some lines should never have been crossed. Months later, Chris finally agreed to meet Margaret for coffee. Their relationship was strained, but it was a start. As they sat across from each other, Margaret apologized once again, her voice filled with pain. "I made a mistake, Chris. One I'll regret for the rest of my life. But I need you to know it was never about hurting you." Chris stared at her for a long moment before sighing. "I'm not ready to forgive you, Mom. But I don't want to lose you either." It wasn't perfect, but Margaret held on to that glimmer of hope, determined to rebuild the bond she had nearly destroyed. Months had passed since the confrontation, but the wounds were far from healed. Margaret's house, once full of warmth and laughter, now echoed with silence. Every room reminded her of Chris's furious face or Ryan's pleading words. She wanted to move forward, but the weight of her choices hung heavily over her life. Chris couldn't escape the anger and confusion bubbling inside him. He tried throwing himself into his work, hitting the gym harder than ever, and even going out with friends to drown out the memories. But every time he thought of his best friend and his mother together, the betrayal felt like a fresh wound. One night, Chris sat alone in his apartment with a beer in hand, scrolling through old photos on his phone. There they were, him and Ryan, grinning in their caps and gowns at high school graduation. His mom in the background, beaming with pride. How did it get to this? The thought nagged at him until he picked up his phone and texted Ryan. "We need to talk. Tomorrow at 7. My place." Ryan stared at the text for a long time. He had been giving Chris space, knowing full well he'd ruined the one friendship that had always been a constant in his life. He wasn't proud of how things had unfolded, but he also couldn't deny how deeply he had cared for Margaret. She wasn't just Chris's mom to him, she was someone who listened, understood, and made him feel like he mattered in a way no one else ever had. But Ryan knew the damage he'd done. This meeting with Chris might be his only chance to make things right, or at least to try. The next evening, Ryan arrived at Chris's apartment. When Chris opened the door, his expression was a mix of anger and exhaustion. "Sit," Chris said flatly, gesturing to the couch. Ryan obeyed, sitting across from Chris, who leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them was thick with tension. Chris finally broke the silence. "Why?" he asked, his voice low but steady. "Out of all the people in the world, why her?" "My mom, Ryan. My mom." Ryan sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know if I can explain it in a way that will make sense to you. But it wasn't about you, Chris. It wasn't about betrayal. I never planned for it to happen. Margaret, your mom, she's incredible. And I fell for her." Chris slammed his fist on the coffee table, making Ryan flinch. "You fell for her? Do you even hear yourself? She's twice your age. She's my mother. Do you know how disgusting this sounds?" "I know it sounds bad," Ryan admitted, his voice shaking. "And I hate that I hurt you. But you need to know, I never meant for this to happen. It just did." Chris stood, pacing the room, his hands on his hips. "You say that like it excuses everything. You could have stopped it, Ryan. Both of you could have stopped it." Ryan nodded, standing as well. "You're right. I should have stopped it. And I didn't because I was selfish. I hurt you and I hurt Margaret too. I'll regret that forever." Chris turned away, his back to Ryan. For a moment, all Ryan could hear was the sound of his friend's heavy breathing. Then Chris spoke, his voice quieter now. "You know what hurts the most? I trusted you. I thought of you as my brother. And now, I don't even know who you are." Ryan swallowed hard, his chest tightening. "I'm still the same person, Chris. But I get it if you don't want anything to do with me anymore." Chris shook his head, still not looking at him. "I don't know if I'll ever forgive you. But I needed to hear you say it. I needed to hear you own up to what you did." Ryan nodded, realizing this was likely the closest he'd get to closure. Meanwhile, Margaret was working on rebuilding her life. She had joined a local book club, started volunteering at the community center, and even began seeing a therapist to work through the guilt and shame that weighed on her. She hadn't heard from Ryan since their final conversation, and Chris had kept their interactions limited to brief, polite exchanges. One evening, Margaret received an unexpected knock on her door. When she opened it, there stood Chris holding a bag of takeout. "Hey Mom," he said awkwardly. "I thought maybe we could have dinner. Like old times." Margaret's eyes welled with tears, but she quickly wiped them away. "I'd love that," she said, stepping aside to let him in. As they sat down to eat, the conversation was stilted at first, but eventually they fell into an easier rhythm. Chris shared stories about work, and Margaret laughed at his sarcastic takes on his co-workers. For the first time in months, they felt like mother and son again. Ryan decided to leave Atlanta. The city held too many memories, and he knew he needed a fresh start. He moved to Denver, where he took up a job as a fitness trainer at a local gym. Slowly, he began to rebuild his life, focusing on himself and leaving the past behind. He often thought about Margaret and Chris, wondering if they'd ever fully recover from what he'd done. He knew he couldn't change the past, but he hoped in time they'd find peace. Months after the explosive confrontation, Margaret sat on her porch, gazing at the falling autumn leaves. Life had quieted down, but the silence was far from peaceful. The weight of her choices loomed over her like a storm cloud, threatening to burst at any moment. Though Chris had started meeting her for coffee, their relationship was still strained, cordial but distant. Margaret longed for the easy laughter and warmth they once shared, but she knew rebuilding that trust would take time. Chris too struggled to find closure. Nights in his small apartment were filled with questions he couldn't answer. He often replayed the events in his mind, wondering how the mother he idolized and the best friend he trusted could betray him so deeply. Anger flared at unexpected moments, when he passed the park where they used to hang out as kids or when he saw an old photo of Ryan in his living room. But anger was exhausting, and Chris was beginning to realize it wasn't serving him. One night, as he scrolled through social media, he stumbled upon a post about a forgiveness workshop hosted by a local community group. It sounded cheesy, but something about it tugged at him. Hesitant but desperate for relief, he signed up. The workshop was held in a small, sunlit room with a circle of mismatched chairs. Chris sat awkwardly, listening to strangers share their stories of betrayal, heartbreak, and forgiveness. At first he felt out of place. What could these people know about his pain? But as the days went by, he began to see that forgiveness wasn't about excusing someone else's actions. It was about freeing yourself from the burden of resentment. Please, if you enjoy tales like this, give this video a thumbs up and subscribe for more captivating stories. Hope you've done? Okay, let's continue. One of the facilitators said something that stuck with him. Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It means choosing not to let the hurt define you anymore. For the first time, Chris realized that holding on to his anger was keeping him tied to the past. He didn't know if he could fully forgive Ryan or his mother, but he was willing to try, for himself. Meanwhile, Margaret had started her own journey of healing. Encouraged by her therapist, she joined a senior book club at the community center. The group quickly became a lifeline, offering her a sense of belonging she hadn't felt in years. One day, after a meeting, a kind man named Arthur struck up a conversation with her. Arthur was a retired history professor, witty and charming in a quiet, understated way. He admired Margaret's insights during the book discussions and often lingered after meetings to chat with her. At first, Margaret was hesitant. After the chaos with Ryan, she wasn't sure she could trust her own feelings. But Arthur was patient, never pushing her for more than she was ready to give. Slowly, Margaret found herself opening up, not just to Arthur, but to the idea that she deserved happiness, even after her mistakes. In Denver, Ryan was building a new life. He poured himself into his work as a fitness trainer, earning the trust of his clients and becoming a respected figure at the gym. Despite his professional success, he often felt a pang of loneliness. Margaret's kindness and Chris's brotherly camaraderie had been constants in his life for so long that their absence felt like a void he couldn't fill. One evening, after a long day at work, Ryan sat in his small apartment and drafted a letter to Chris. Dear Chris, I know I'm probably the last person you want to hear from, but I need to say this. I'm sorry, not just for what I did but for the way I hurt you. You were my brother and I failed you in the worst way. I don't expect forgiveness, but I want you to know I'm working every day to be a better man. I hope in time you can find peace. He didn't send it. Instead, he tucked it away in a drawer, unsure if Chris would ever want to hear from him again. On a crisp winter morning, Chris visited his mother's house for the first time since the confrontation. They sat at the kitchen table, the tension palpable but less suffocating than before. I'm trying, Mom, Chris said, breaking the silence. I'm not there yet, but I don't want to lose you. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. I don't deserve your forgiveness, Chris, but I'll spend the rest of my life making things right. As they talked, the first seeds of true healing were planted. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start, a fragile bridge spanning the chasm of their pain. Far away in Denver, Ryan watched the snow fall outside his window. He didn't know what the future held, but he clung to the hope that time might heal the wounds he had caused. Sometimes healing doesn't come all at once. It arrives in small, quiet moments, like a winter thaw, slowly melting the frost to make room for new beginnings.